Today we're going to talk a little bit about what happens when humans and security technology interact. And I know that I had privacy on there initially, but I kind of removed it so that we could have enough time to talk about security, but we can chat about privacy a bit later if you'd like to. So let's get started. So let's start with a question. So have you ever written down your password or reused it or shared it with someone else? And what about how carefully do you verify the authenticity of each website you visit? And I realize here that I'm talking to a very technical audience, and you're probably well aware of the risks that come into play here. But assuming that none of you are robots, and by nature, it's highly unlikely and probably impossible that you consistently and continuously apply all security advice all the time, even if you know what these rules are and why they're important. And that's kind of the point, right? So when you're dealing with technology and security, you're also dealing with the humans, and they're part of the whole system. So let's dive into it for a bit. So we see these headlines all the time, right? We hear talks at conferences, and you're all probably nodding to yourself because this is clearly a big problem in security, and it might even be the biggest problem in security, right? Humans are the weakest link. Users are the weakest link. They are the problem with security. And if we could just fix the humans, then life would be good. And I'm here today to argue that this is kind of a counterproductive point of view that's going to get us nowhere really with respect to security. Because we talk about users, they're making errors, they're violating policies, they're circumventing security, they're using security tools incorrectly, or they're not using them at all. I get it. But over the next while, I want to show you that there are things that we can do to improve security, but they don't involve building better humans, because that's kind of impossible. And I'm not really the only usable security researcher that has this perspective. So for example, this was well articulated in as early as 2001 by some UCL researchers who looked at the user behavior with passwords. And they found that, while users do have a lot of coping strategies in relation to passwords, these are primarily being caused by assigning tasks that are incompatible with human memory. They have conflicting task demands where they have to prioritize something else, or they lack the training or support so that they fully understand the risks involved with what they're doing. And so what's happening here is that, yes, users are making mistakes and doing things that we prefer that they didn't do, but we're not going to be able to fix the problem by tackling making better humans. So instead, rather than getting stuck in the mindset that users are the weakest link, let's instead consider that maybe it's our designs of the user interactions when it comes to security that are a problem. And here I want to highlight that security and usability aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but there is a really complex interaction between the two. And often the most effective solution is going to need to balance trade-offs from both sides. And now, ideally, we can find solutions that can maximize both, but elegant solutions like this, where both usability and security are maximized, are often a little bit elusive. And where we can't maximize both of them, leaning too far on the security side will actually be counterproductive, because in most cases, that's going to lead to less security in practice. And there's been several studies showing this in different contexts, but one of the ones that sort of sticks with me is with password policies. And as we make password policies stricter, we get increased security. So we are making progress, but there's a point where the resulting passwords actually start to become weaker because users need to use more and more coping strategies to deal with the fact that the security policies are becoming completely unreasonable. And so we need to move to that sweet spot where we're actually still seeing the increase in security without having to have the compensation behaviors where users are having to introduce all kinds of coping strategies. Now, this isn't a new idea. And as far back as 1975, Salzer and Schroeder introduced this principle of psychological acceptability. And this was among a list of 8 principles for the protection of information in security systems. And the principle of psychological acceptability talks about it being essential that the human interface is designed for ease of use and that the protection goals of the user has to match the mechanisms that are provided to the user. Otherwise, there's going to be errors introduced. And then the idea was basically largely ignored for a couple of decades. We sort of focused on the technical aspects of security, which are clearly important, but they're not the whole picture. And then if we move forward a couple of decades, we get to 1999. And Witten and Tygar published a paper at User Security, and it was called Why Johnny Can't Encrypt. And this was sort of a high-profile conference, and it got some attention. And in it, they showed that basically the complete usability disaster that was email encryption at the time. And however elegant you might think that public cryptography might be, it's not a straightforward concept, and it's definitely not one that users should have to deal with. And this paper started to raise awareness among the security community about the importance of the usability of security applications, right? This wasn't just a nice to have kind of thing. This was, without usability, you are fundamentally breaking the security of your system. And in their paper, they go through 5 properties of security that make it especially difficult from a user interface design perspective. And we'll touch on several of them as we go through this talk. And since then, the message of the importance of usability in security keeps coming up. So here it is in the US Department of Homeland Security. They released a roadmap for cybersecurity research, and they specifically say that in the absence of usable security, there is ultimately no effective security. And yet, decades later, decades from the original psychological acceptability principle, we're still pretty far from achieving this goal. So let's look at some of the issues that come into play and why this is a problem and what we might possibly do about it. So why is it so hard? Well, the first thing that happens is that security is a secondary task. And, other than the few people who might be, in this room, no one sits at the computer to do security, right? They want to check their email, they want to play a game, they want to finish their accounting tasks, they want to, do their banking. And security is this barrier that stands in the way between them accomplishing their original goal. And it's just sort of something that interrupts them. So imagine that you're at home and you're in a hurry to get something done, right? You type in a URL and something that looks like this pops up. And you've all seen these certificate warnings before. You may even have worked on some of them. And we've certainly made a lot of progress in the last couple of decades on how to present security warnings. And the wording is a lot better than it used to be. Some of the visual cues have improved, right? We're now making it easier to detect these things. However, the reality is that this is still a barrier. And because security is a secondary task, this is what most users actually see when these things pop up, right? It's blah, 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 a whole bunch of gibberish. And it doesn't matter how well presented it is, the immediate goal becomes, how do I make this go away as quickly as possible so that I can continue on with my primary goal? And so the first principle that I want to bring up here is that we need to provide better information, not more information. And going even further than that, when it's possible, we should just be making these security decisions for the user. They shouldn't have to deal with this. So for example, we don't ask users where exactly they want to save something on their hard drive, right? That's a low-level technical detail that they just assume that we're going to be taken care of. And many security decisions fall under the same category for users, right? Their reaction is, why are you asking this of me, right? I'm not the one who should be making this decision. And there are circumstances where we do have to ask. However, if you do have to ask, then make sure that you're giving the users an actual decision that they're capable of making. So don't just leave them with this unsolvable dilemma from their perspective, right? So if we think back to the website from the previous slide, right? From the user's perspective, they want to visit website X and you're telling them not to visit. And so, this is this dilemma. Now they have to figure out, well, do they give up their primary goal to listen to you, or do they take what seems to possibly be a risk to be able to accomplish their goal? So what isn't being offered to them at this point is a safe way of visiting X, because that's what ultimately they actually want to be doing. Now, you might argue that the certificate warning is a legitimate choice. You can visit X or you can do the safe thing. However, for most users, most of the time, it isn't a choice, right? So in 2013, there was a study with a large data set over several months, and it showed that for every true positive certificate warning, users saw 15,400 false positives. And so we've created this problem where, from the user's perspective, the only logical or the only rational thing to do is to ignore these warnings, because in most cases, it is safe to visit website X. And so the warning at this point isn't really a decision for the user, right? It's just this annoying thing that they have to swat away. Now, speaking of being rational, there's this interesting paper by Cormac Hurley from 2009 called The Rational Rejection of Security Advice. And the main argument in the paper is that security has significant costs in terms of users' time and users' effort. And if we consider all of the security advice that we give users across all the different contexts, they would spend a significant portion of their time on these security tasks as opposed to what they actually want to be doing. And from their perspective, it's just not worth it, right? So as security researchers, we're trained to consider the worst case scenario. However, for most people, that's highly unlikely to happen. And so given this, it's easy to see why users would throw up their hands and say, I give up, I'll take my chances with being attacked, because dealing with the occasional aftermath of a problem is way more appealing than having to do this continuous stress of constant vigilance all of the time, right? Because that's in all reasonable cases, that's kind of an unmanageable proposition. And so we need to have this favorable cost-benefit ratio from the user's perspective, because the user's effort is not free, right? Every time we're imposing a security requirement, even if it's for the user's own good, there is a cost to that from the user's perspective. And many times we seem to be kind of forgetting that that is a factor in the equation. And so the principle that comes out of this is that we need to respect users' time and their effort. And we need to provide suitable mechanisms that users won't want or won't need to bypass. And these mechanisms have to be reasonable to use in the context of everything else that they have going on. And I often give this example of, humans or your users don't have, a security brain and an everything else brain, or a work brain and an everything else brain. And so it's not like there's this big empty space that they can just allocate to security in the absence of everything else. They have to be doing this while they're managing everything else that's happening in their life. And if your mechanism doesn't work in that context, it doesn't work in practice. And there's this second principle that's kind of important that comes into play here. And this is that we should provide a path of least resistance where the secure option is the default option that users are presented with. And notice that, however, the most often way that this is implemented is to stop the user from doing whatever it is that they were meant to be doing, right? And this directly contradicts the previous principle, because it sets up this situation where the user basically has to bypass the mechanism if they want to accomplish their goal. And so the real challenge is, how do we provide secure options in a path of least resistance that actually allow the user to achieve their primary goal? Because remember, the goal isn't security, it's whatever the primary task was in the first place. And so if we're setting up a security system where the default is you can't do what you want to do, we're failing. And so we need to find a way of achieving this path of least resistance without hindering the user in a way that stops them from achieving their goals. Now, let's consider the next property of security that makes life even more complicated. And that's, with every new technology, there's the possibility of new attacks. And the second thing is that we have these active adversaries that are trying to breach the system. And these two properties make usable security extra complicated, right? Because first, we have to keep changing the advice that we give users. And the actions that were once secure might not be sufficient anymore. And so it's not like we have to train them once and we're done. It's that we have to train them, and then a few months later, we have to train them again with new advice. And we have to say, oh no, what we told you a few months ago, yeah, that no longer is enough. So now we've got to do more. And the second thing is that in most design spaces, you worry about how to help the user and make things as simple as possible. But in security, we actually have two groups of users, right? We have the legitimate ones for whom you want to make life as easy as possible. But then there's the illegitimate users for whom you want to make life impossible. And oftentimes those two things are in direct conflict, because as the security person, you don't actually know who's at the system at any given point in time. And so somehow you want to make life easy and impossible at the same time for the right type of user. right? And that's really kind of weird. Because, if you think of, say, designers of a word processing application, right, you don't constantly have to be thinking, how do I make it impossible for some users to reach their goal? But in security, that's exactly what we have to be doing. So let's think about phishing for a few minutes. And we have a lot of automated tools that detect phishing, and they now catch many of the more obvious scams. So a lot of phishing emails or phishing websites are just being taken offline without having to reach the user at all, which is great. But by definition, what makes it to the user now could not be detected by our best attempts as security professionals, right? So now we rely on users, remember, whose security is not the primary task, who are not security professionals, to detect attacks that are specifically designed to trick them. And these are the attacks that we as security professionals missed. And yet we blame users when they fall for these very attacks, right, that we as experts failed to detect. And this is not, a great situation to be in if that's your, line of defense for protecting your system. And we've done studies where we told users that we were going to show them websites, and their only task at this given point in time was to tell us, is this a legitimate website or a phishing website? So they sat at the computer, they knew that was their goal, and that was their primary task. And even when the task was their sole focus, they basically had a 50-50 shot of getting it right? It was a coin toss. They were guessing. So clearly this isn't something that we should be passing on to end users, because we're just setting the system up to fail. Now, there's been various advances in phishing detection over the last few years, and it's one of the areas that historically is sort of one of the more popular areas of usable security. Let's kind of dive into one of these areas here for a sec. The main problem with phishing is one of mutual authentication, right? The user has to provide credentials to prove their identity, but the site doesn't really have to prove to the user that they're legitimate. And there's exception to this, particularly with some encryption protocols, but at this point, they're the exception, not the norm in what most users experience. So let's consider this attempt here on the screen with helping users with phishing. And so this is an example of a personalized indicator where the user and the website agree on a secret ahead of time. So in this case, this is this image. And the way the system unfolds, excuse me, is that the user provides their username, the site displays the agreed upon image, and if the site displays the right image, the user knows that, oh, okay, I'm at the website, I should be able to enter my password. Now, technically, there's more to it behind the scenes, but from the user's perspective, this is what happens. And one thing to note here is that people are really bad at noticing the absence of a cue. So basically, it's the concept of out of sight, out of mind. So, from the beginning, relying on them to realize that an image is missing is a problem to begin with. So one plausible attack here is just to, as a phishing website, not show the image, and most users are just going to happily continue on because they're not good at recognizing the absence of a security cue. However, there is another type of attack that happens here. And here's one of the other ways where things can go wrong. So this is from an attack in a paper in 2007 by Schechter et al. Called The Emperor's New Security Indicators. And the way they launched their attack is, so they showed the login screen, people entered the username, then they showed a message that said, oops, our image server is down for maintenance, please proceed with entering your password anyway, it's okay. And then showed the password field. And 97% of people logged in anyway. And now you might be saying, 2007, we've evolved since then. But this was repeated in 2016 with a study out of ETH, where they did basically the similar thing with a smartphone app. And they had various versions of this attack. And half of participants still fell for this attack. And so here they did things like they showed a random image instead of the personalized image. They showed no image at all, or they showed this, maintenance warning. And 50% of people still fell for the attack. But wait, right? It gets worse. And you might be shaking your head at this point, right? At the users thinking like, why are they falling for this thing, right? Specifically when the phishing site points out that the security key that they should be relying on is missing, right? Like we've set it up so that users should be able to figure this out. Guess what? We've trained them specifically to do this, right? I'm sure you've all found yourself in a position at some point where you're walking someone through some task on the computer and you tell them, okay, so next you're going to see this pop up, just click OK, right? We've all done this. We've done this many times. So we've conditioned users that this is how they should respond, right? After all, we are the trusted advisors and we've told them to do so. But getting back to personalized indicators. So here's a recent screenshot from an actual legitimate bank. And they've essentially faked a phishing attack, right? Except that this is a true message given to users. So if you look at the center of the screen here, right, wondering where your pictures and phrases are, we're adding new security enhanced features and have decided to discontinue the picture and the phrase, right? Please log in anyway. So the actual real bank wants users to log in and ignore the fact that the image is missing. And so, if you take all of this into account, it's really no wonder that users ignore security cues because we've kind of set them up that this is how things should happen. And so the relevant principle here is that we need to reliably inform users of security or privacy tasks that they must perform. And these things should be tasks that they can reliably perform. And, right, we can't be undermining these messages. So if we tell them, this is what you need to do, this is how you do it, we can't then as a community say, oh, but sometimes it's okay to ignore them, right? We have to be consistent one way or the other. So moving on, here is another problem, property of security that's problematic. And I fully admit here that when I first came to this area of usable security as a grad student, I naively thought, if only these security people learned a little bit about human-computer interaction, things would be okay. And I kind of set out, in my first project to show that this was the case. But I very quickly came to the realization that security is actually a very unique design space. And many of the traditional design principles that we are normally used to using just don't apply or can't be applied directly. So, for example, feedback, right? In HCI, we are told we should be giving feedback to the user as often as possible. They should always know what's happening in the system, and they should, be aware of what they should be doing and what they've possibly done wrong, how they can possibly fix it. Now, in security, feedback isn't always possible, and that makes designs very complicated. So remember our two types of users that we talked about, right? The legitimate users and the illegitimate users. And this is where we run into problems. So if you consider login interfaces, right? So if a user comes, they enter their username and password, they get it incorrect. From a strictly HCI perspective, what should happen at this point should be that the system says, oh, you mistyped your password. You had cap locks on. Please turn off cap locks and type it in again, and you will be okay. Now, clearly, we can't do that because of the attackers that are also trying to break into the system. And so now we have to find a way of providing feedback to the legitimate user in a way that makes sense and is helpful to them, but that doesn't leak any information to the illegitimate users. So in HCI, there's a set of usability heuristics, and they're Nielsen's 10 usability heuristics. And what we have to do with authentication feedback is violate two of those HCI sort of fundamental principles. So the first one is visibility of system status, where we should be telling them exactly what is going on, right? Like your mistake was you put in an extra hour here. And the second principle is help users recognize, diagnose, and recover from errors. And again, here, we should be telling users, just type it again this way, this is your password, and everything will be okay. And we can't do that. And so now we're left with a principle of, from a security perspective, of we need to provide sufficient feedback for users to have awareness of the system status. However, you must do this in a way that reliably informs legitimate users without informing attackers, and without using cues that can be easily spoofed by attackers. And so, you can quickly see that this principle here, instead of being something easy to follow, is kind of a big challenge, right? And so this is one of the sort of open problems in security, is how do we help the legitimate users without helping the attackers or giving them means to which they can more easily deceive legitimate users. So let's keep going. Another property of security is the possibility of what we call dangerous errors. And these are errors where undo is not always possible. And if we've left the data vulnerable even for a short time, it's not possible to know if it's been compromised. And so from a user's perspective, this is kind of weird, because if you think about the analog in the physical world, imagine that you're at your house, you can't find your keys and your house key, and you just have to go to the store for a second, and the store is just around the corner. And so you might close your door and just run out without locking the door. You get to the store, you come back home, everything looks nice and calm. You come in, there's no one around, everything is good. And so, you're fairly reassured that, yep, we're fine. I took a risk, but there was no problem. When we're talking about computer security, from the user's perspective, it's almost impossible to know whether there's been a problem in that short span of time where there was a possible gap in security. It might be okay, but it might not. And so this is the situation where we have dangerous errors. This is where we've put the user has done something that might possibly compromise, and it's hard to back out of at this point. So consider the case of email attachments or email links, right? The user might, if they're thinking about the the relationship to the physical model, they could think, I'll just have a quick look at this attachment, and if it looks suspicious, I'll close it quickly and then it'll be fine. But that doesn't cut it here, right? Of course, because as soon as you've opened the attachment, it's too late. And so we somehow have to find ourselves in a situation where we don't let these dangerous errors happen in the first place. And so the associated principle is, anticipate situations where you might have dangerous errors and find a way to mitigate these. Now, if we're thinking about the email links, if you're in a highly sensitive environment, maybe you disable links altogether, right? That will stop users from accidentally clicking on something they shouldn't. Now, that's kind of the extreme measure where you're taking security at the cost of usability. So maybe there's other things. Maybe you can pre-scan links to make sure that they look safe and so that you reduce the risk in case a user does click on it. But remember that if you provide users with a means to do something, you can't just expect that everyone is going to avoid it. So if you have links enabled in your email, some people are going to click on them for various reasons, right? There's always going to be a situation, no matter how aware and careful the user is, where the link is just going to look reasonable. It's going to look legitimate. The context of where it's come in, everything has just kind of worked out, and this seems like a perfectly plausible thing that they should be clicking on. And so we're never going to be able to fully rely on users to recognize, legitimate links versus illegitimate links, because these are just meant to be tricking users. So even with the best of intentions, right, users may do something that inadvertently exposes a security vulnerability. And it's even more complicated because sometimes users will complete the actual recommended security action, but they're going to do so in a way that follows a predictable pattern, so that if you look at it across a whole bunch of users, then that can be exploited by attackers. And so now, not only are users having to worry about, what am I doing something that's insecure or secure, they have to worry about, am I doing something that might plausibly be the same as what everybody else is doing, and is that possibly leaking information? So for example, what do these passwords here have in common, right? At first glance, they look like pretty reasonable random sets of letters and numbers. However, if you're sitting at your keyboard, look down and start looking at these passwords, and you'll notice that they are keyboard patterns, right? So they're nice sequences on the keyboard themselves. And so where you as a user might have initially thought, I am being really clever, I've come up with something that looks perfectly random, and there is a cue that helps me remember what this random thing looks like. And so initially, yay, that looks fantastic. But guess what? Other people are going to be thinking the exact same thing as you. And so when multiple people have the same idea, now this is something that an attacker can leverage. And so these common patterns make their way into guessing attack dictionaries. And so they're no longer as secure as they might have been initially. So while we're on the topic of passwords and authentication, let's think a little bit about other security rules and password policies that come into play, right? So we've got these crazy policies about the composition of passwords where you've got, the rules about uppercase, lowercase can't be the same as, your username can't be the same as anything else. So you're all aware of the rules. We tell people that they can't share their passwords. They shouldn't be writing down their passwords. They should be changing their passwords regularly. And this whole set of rules that we call sort of password hygiene are actually setting up users for an impossible task, right? It's actually, if you only had one password, this might be a reasonable set of things to do. However, users have dozens, if not hundreds of passwords. And so when taken into context, these are actually, completely impossible, unreasonable recommendations, and something that there is no way that users can plausibly do on a regular basis. And so if this is what your password policy looks like, you are, probably sort of turning a blind eye to what is actually happening in practice, because there's no way users are implementing these without implementing coping mechanisms. Now, over the last few decades, there's been a lot of research into passwords and authentication and various alternatives to text passwords. And this continues to be one of the most researched areas in usable security. Each of the alternatives to passwords have their own advantages and disadvantages. But the reality is we keep coming back to passwords themselves for various reasons, mostly because they're convenient to implement and they're everywhere. So this is kind of the status quo. In 2017, NIST came up with a revised set of guidelines for what password policies should look like. And I think that if you haven't seen this set of recommendations, I highly recommend you have a look at them, because in all of the years of password research, they're kind of like the first set of guidelines that are sort of widely recommended, that actually seem to strike a reasonable compromise between security and usability. So they take into account the fact that you've got human users at the other end of the system. And so here's a few of NIST's recommendations. So the first one is support alternative authenticators. So don't force users to use passwords. If there's other mechanisms that are more appropriate, let them use that, and possibly give users a choice of what makes the most sense for them in a particular context. Offer the option to display text during password entry. And so oftentimes users make mistakes when they're entering their password. And when you type your password in and you get the password incorrect thing, the first thing you do is you sit there and you retype the exact same thing much more slowly to see if you didn't make a typo when you typed it in. If users could actually see what they're typing, that would go away. And in most circumstances, users are sitting in their office and there's no one looking over their shoulder, and displaying the text password would be a perfectly reasonable and secure thing to do. Now, of course, if they're in a public library and there's 10 people behind them, then they should have the option of hiding it. The second one is allow at least 10 attempts and let users know how many are remaining. Because there's nothing worse than this fear of like, should I try again, or am I about to be locked out? And from the user's perspective, when you only allow 3 attempts, the real person that you're harming here is the user and not the attacker, because the legitimate user is going to do exactly what I said, right? When you get the incorrect password, you're going to type the exact same thing more slowly, first of all. And then you're going to, if it's still incorrect, you're going to think, oh, wait, did I do it right? And you're going to try again. And then you've wasted most of your attempts on retyping exactly the same thing you just typed in the first place. And you're locked out. A legitimate or an illegitimate user, an attacker, is never going to retype the same password. And so who you're hurting at this point by having a very small number of guesses is the legitimate user. So give them a reasonable number. And then other ones that NIST recommends is, minimize the number of secrets. So if you can have, federated logins, do that where possible. Support copy paste. They recognize that people may have passwords stored somewhere, possibly securely on their local drive or in some sort of password manager. Let them copy paste. Allow longer passwords. I still have a bank password that rejects my password because it's too long, which seems like a ridiculous limit to put at this point, right? Like just let them type whatever they want. And don't require arbitrary password changes. If you have a legitimate reason for thinking that your system may have been compromised, by all means, right? Force password changes, because now there is a logical reason why users have to do this. But if it's April 31st, that's not a real reason why passwords should be changed. And we actually have a paper that looks at, the possible advantage that you might get in security from mandatory password changes. And it is so small that it's basically negligible and completely wiped out by what users are going to have to do in response, right? They're going to have to start using patterns in their passwords. They're going to have to start writing them down somewhere where it's easier for them to have access to. And so you're basically just forcing weaker passwords when you're doing that. And then when you're introducing other types of authentication, so for example, your token or something else, think about the usability of these, right? How likely is it that the user is going to have their phone on hand when they need to get their one-time password? How easy is it for them to maybe forget their little dongle at home or whatever it is? And that should all be taken into account when you are considering your authentication mechanisms. So I think these NIST rules have gone sort of a long way in providing practical advice that balances both security and usability. And so, the principle that follows along here is that you should be designing tasks that your target users are able to routinely complete correctly. So if you set your users up for success, then they're more likely to not circumvent your security policies. And so while we're talking about security policies and password policies, I want to leave you with a couple more things to think about. And the first one is to consider your policy and your demand in context, right? So we've now reached this situation where password policies used to be 2 or 3 things that users had to do. We've now added more and more and more and more and more rules, and it's now become this insane list. And so I would challenge you that if you are adding a rule to your security policy, which one is being removed? Because you can't just infinitely keep adding rules, because that's just not feasible. It's not going to work from the user's perspective. And how much is your new rule impacting real work, right? Is this getting in the way of them completing their primary task? And if it really is, guess what? What you've just introduced is extra incentive for users to circumvent the security of your system. Consider human capabilities, right? The human brain is not meant to be doing things like being continuously, constantly vigilant for attack, right? That's a highly stressful situation. It involves, a whole bunch of like adrenaline and stress hormones, and we can't do it continuously. And so if your security is relying on users to be continuously in that mode, guess what? It's not going to happen. Same thing for password policies. If your password policies are relying on people memorizing these crazy long random strings of nonsense. That's not what the human brain is meant to do. The human brain is actually built to forget random bits of nonsense because they're deemed as not useful information. And so now we're asking users to do something that their brain is just not meant to be doing. And so, you have to take into account human capabilities when you're designing your security mechanisms. And then the last one I want to mention here is that there's a need for realistic, actionable advice, right? Users need, if you are going to give them advice, if you are going to give them education, users need to understand why it's important and how the action is beneficial. Now, you don't need to be explaining to them all of the underlying technical details, but they need to have something that they can build a mental model on so that they understand why they're doing this thing and it's not just this arbitrary rule. And so I'll leave you with one last principle here, and that is to selectively educate, but improved designs are always preferable over user education, right? We're not going to build better humans, and education can only go so far. And so what we need are better designs. And so this is the last slide, and we return to our initial argument, right? It's not that users are the weakest link, but it's that there's fundamental flaws in how our systems are being designed. And this makes them unusable in realistic use scenarios. And that leads to security vulnerability. So there's this mismatch between human capabilities and what the systems are demanding. And there isn't necessarily an easy fix. And many of the problems that I've presented here are in fact open problems. We know what needs to be achieved, and we can do it in some contexts, but these principles are far from universally applied because it's hard. Sometimes there's relatively cosmetic things that can be fixed, but oftentimes there's a much deeper and more fundamental problem. And it's something that needs to be considered from the very early days of designing security systems, right? The usability can't be added on after the fact. So even if your work deals with some very low-level technical aspect of the security of the system, you can't just ignore what's going to be happening down the line, right? Keep in mind how it might ultimately be used and how it's going to be applied in practice, because that's the only way that we're going to achieve sort of practical security. And so I'll leave it there because I think we're getting close to the hour, and I'm happy to answer any questions and chat with you on whatever you might want to. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia, for your very interesting and inspiring presentation. So I believe it's not only in my name, but also